Happy Friday to each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining us today as we are continuing our study in the book of 1 Samuel, which is a part of a much grander study that we are calling Walking Through History. My name is Nick Angel, and joining me as always is my good friend Alan Sienestrang, and we are leading this journey through the story of the Bible, which begins in Genesis and obviously concludes at the end of the Revelation, but all of this is pointing towards Jesus, the promised Son and Messiah of God, who would fulfill God's desires for his people to be his people and to be his people his way and to glorify him and to reflect his image in all that they do. We have seen in the book of the Judges just how bad things can get. And yet we're going to see in Samuel really both sides of the coin. We're going to see some really high points with the three main characters within Samuel, King Saul, and King David. We'll also see some low points for each of these individuals. Yet it all is pushing us towards Jesus, looking for that perfect one to whom we can follow and who sets a perfect example for us to try to emulate within our own lives. In our last study on Tuesday, we talked from chapter 1. We read and reflected upon chapter 1 and the main characters who are introduced to us here. Elkanah and his wife Hannah are the main positive characters, with Peninnah being the adversary in this text, who is hateful and antagonistic and just flat out mean and rude towards her counterpart. Hannah is without child, and yet even though she is brokenhearted, even though she is hurting, even though she is anguished and even feeling resentful, she still goes to God and prays that her big God would listen to her little prayer, the little prayer of a little person of insignificance, and that he might remember her. And he does. He blesses her with a son, and she promised that son would be dedicated to the Lord in his service. And now as we pick up here in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, we are going to see this second prayer, this triumphant prayer, this prayer of glorifying God and recognizing who he is and how it is that his character has brought about this great victory within her own life. We're going to look at that prayer here in chapter 2, and then we're going to see some of the dark underbelly of Israel at this time. And unfortunately, it really revolves around the priest, those who are in spiritual religious leadership. They're failing in a miserable way, and we're going to look at that and see how it sets us up for the story moving forward. Alan, it is good to see you today. Hope you're doing well, and man, I'd love for you to read this prayer, this beautiful prayer of Hannah for us whenever you get the chance.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and get started here. We'll read through it. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, Hannah prayed, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you, and there is no rock like our God. Do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. The bows of the warriors are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. Those who full hire themselves out for food, but those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some down to Sheol, and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the trash heap. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundation of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them. He guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness. For a person does not prevail by his own strength. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. He will lift up the horn of his anointed.
Alan, this is again a very beautiful prayer that is offered up by Hannah in this text, and it seems like this might have been a prayer that was offered at this time when Elkanah and Hannah go and present Samuel to Eli for him to be raised there by Eli and be dedicated to the Lord. This is her response. at the end of the culmination of this long road for her, so much of it has been stained by her tears, by her anguish, by her heartache of not having a child. And now she is so thankful to the Lord for a child that she is fulfilling her promise and dedicating that child to the Lord. This is her now expressing God's goodness, God's faithfulness, and God's ability to fulfill his word and to do as he is capable of doing, and showing faithfulness to his people. I want to share just real quickly. I want to share real quickly another portion of the Bible Project's poster for Samuel. And this just looks at Hannah's song, her prayer here in chapter 2, and really breaks it down into the three portions. The first portion being the fact that God opposes the proud and he exalts the humble. And you can see that from just the relationship between Peninnah and Hannah, that Peninnah was the person who was in this exalted position of being proud because of her children. She taunted Hannah because she did not have any children. And yet Hannah here says that the Lord isn't with those who are haughty, those who are prideful, those who are arrogant, but he's with the lowly and he exalts them. Then she talks about how even though there is human evil that is present among mankind, that God is still at work. He is still faithful to those who trust him. And then finally at the end, there's this mention about God giving power to his king. And that portion has caused some issues, Alan, because some would say, well, the fact that this is mentioned here, it shows us that there's been additions that are not workable to the text. Because how can Hannah know anything about a king? So how would you respond to someone if someone raises that objection at this point, Alan?
Well, it mentions in verse 10, I mean, he will give power to his king. So it's not necessitating that there is a king right now, but something that they can look forward to, which, I mean, Moses has done that as well. I mean, he talks about, when you get into the land and when you have a king, here are the rules for the king. Well, obviously that hadn't happened yet. And at this point, Saul hasn't been anointed as the first king. David hasn't even been born yet. So this is still in the distant future, but that's, I mean, again, she's looking forward to the future. She understood enough about what Moses was mentioning and looking toward that, or, God gave her some prophetic powers here to kind of look forward. She can, and I mean, look at these themes that she's talking about. God opposes the proud, exalts the humble. I mean, she's smart enough and knows her Bible, knows the story of the people of Israel long enough to know that that's what God's been doing. I mean, he brought out the people of Israel. They were as humble as they could be, being slaves in the land of Egypt, and he opposed the great king and the might of Egypt, and exalted this lowly people and turned them into a nation. Mm-hmm. And now, I mean, we've already seen individual stories of just humble, lowly people. Ruth, and now we have Hannah. There's a lot of connections between this song and the song of Mary in Luke chapter 2. The Magnificat, we call it. Kind of begins the same way and has similar themes, just talking about, God exalting the humble, the lowly. And I mean, that's what he did Mary was just a nobody, and yet she became the mother of our Lord. And here's Hannah. She's pretty much a nobody, but she becomes the mother of, the last great judge and the bridge to the kingdom period, who eventually will anoint two kings, both Saul and David. So she's picking up on these themes throughout this song, and looking forward to a time when God will not just raise up a king. I think this is one of those times. Most of the prophetic words in the Bible, usually, they might have one specific meaning, but a lot of the times they've got, there's two or three things they're looking at, and I think this is another instance. This can be pointing toward the coming of a king chosen by God and David, which makes sense, given the the rest of the book of Samuel, most of it's going to be about David. That's what we're really pointing toward. And then, of course, a lot of the wording here, the anointed, I think earlier mentions, because in verse 1, it mentions the word salvation. Well, those words are very messianic. A lot of times, even I think that word in verse 1 that we translate salvation is Jeshua, which is Joshua in the Hebrew, which would be Jesus in Greek. That's that same word that we use, that Jesus is called by. So very messianic language here, pointing us toward a even greater salvation coming from God down the road, either through David or through David's most famous descendant.
Now, I'll point out too, Alan, that we can even go prior to Moses, go all the way back to Genesis 17 in verse number 6, whenever the Lord is appearing to 99-year-old Abraham, and he is telling Abraham about this covenant that he's going to set up between himself and Abraham and his descendants. And he says in Genesis 17 and verse 6 that I will make you extremely fruitful and will make nations and kings come from you. So though Hannah herself has not seen a king rule over Israel, she's anticipating that God is going to continue to fulfill his promises. And he's going to do exactly as he says, that he is going to bring kings and from his people. And in doing so, that will show God's power in fulfilling those promises and establishing his rule among his people in this way. So this is not something that is incompatible with the context of Hannah's time frame, or with the context of the life that Hannah's living. She's looking forward very much so to God's promises being fulfilled. And she has seen that God has the power to even give her a child after being barren for so long. If God can do this, then surely God can do these other great things that he has promised as well. And I believe you're very much accurate as well in saying that this can have various levels of meaning, not just that there are going to be kings coming soon, but there is going to be the king who will eventually come. We can look back and we can see how it works out throughout the history of Israel. But yeah, these three points I think are very important. And really, if we took this text, 1 Samuel 2, 1 through 10, and we just dropped it somewhere in the Psalter, nobody being none the wiser. I mean, it really does. It just fits very, it would fit very nicely anywhere within that text. It has all the markers of a psalm from the divinely inspired Psalter.
And it works good as a introduction here, or a kind of not a prelude, but a beginning to the whole text of Samuel, because as we'll see, Samuel only really lasts the first couple of chapters, and then the bulk of the book is about Saul and then mostly David, and their interaction with each other. And what we see, Saul is a king that the people wanted, and then David is a king that really God wanted, that type of king. And we'll see that Saul, even though he starts off okay, he's going to very much fall away quickly and be rejected by God. And he kind of represents the
proud,
that is mentioned in this summary, or the evil that God opposes. And then that is going to be a great contrast to the good heart of David, and the love that God had for David, even though David obviously is not going to end up being perfect either. The whole book of Samuel is kind of comparing the two, Saul versus David, the whole time. So this psalm, or this song or prayer, whatever you call it, is really just almost the summary of what we're going to see throughout these next two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel.
Absolutely.
Really one book together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much. I'd agree. It does set a good perspective for us to look through as we're looking at the text that's going to follow. Absolutely. Continuing on in the text, Alan, in verse 11, we read that Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy served, that's referring to Samuel. He served the Lord in the presence of the priest Eli, and you would think that he's in an environment where he is going to be able to learn to serve the Lord in a wonderful fashion. He's going to have wonderful role models to look up to. And yet that simply isn't the case, because we read in verse 12 that Eli's sons were wicked men. Even though they were priests, they were wicked men, and they did not respect the Lord or the priest share of the sacrifices from the people. When anyone offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a three-pronged meat fork while the meat was boiling and plunge it into the container, kettle, cauldron, or cooking pot. And the priest would claim for himself whatever the meat fork brought up. And this is the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh. Even though the fat was burned, or even before the fat was burned, the priest servant would come and say to the one who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast, because he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." And if the person said to him, "The fat must be burned first, then you can take whatever you want for yourself," the servant would reply, "No, I insist that you hand it over to me right now. And if you don't, I'll take it by force." So the servant's sin was very severe in the presence of the Lord, because the men treated the Lord's offering with contempt. Alan, give us some background. What is the issue with what these priests were doing, and what was actually provided for them within the law that they were violating here in this moment, or in these
I mean,
moments?
there were provisions in the law. I mean, obviously the priests had to eat, and they needed, you know, they couldn't just minister the Lord; they had to eat, and there were portions of these sacrifices that were dedicated to them. But what's happening is they're taking more than they were allowed to, and taking it by force. And it mentions even when the people come and they say, "Hey, you're supposed to." I mean, they were the ones that knew better. They say, "Hey, the fat must be burned first," in verse 16. But the priests and the servants would say, "No, I'm going to take it from you by force." So they took much more than they should have, which is, I guess, the equivalent of you know sticking your hand in the collection plate and taking taking what you want out of that or something, or the elders taking a portion of the collection and doing what they want with it. I mean, that's we would look at that and just think that was just the worst thing possible, and that's exactly what it was here. It says they had contempt for the offering. They did not respect the Lord. They were stealing, and that's not even the worst thing that we're going to see from them. But all of this, really, these early verses are really just kind of contrasting the righteousness of Samuel, who was not even a son of Eli. I mean, he was dedicated to the Lord and raised up in that in the tabernacle there, but he wasn't even the blood son. It was these other sons of Eli. They should have been known better, and they were not doing what they were supposed to. So we get that contrast here between the two.
Even more specifically, the priest was allotted the breast and the right leg. That's from Leviticus chapter 7. But here they would just stick their fork in and grab whatever they wanted to. The fat was supposed to be burned off in honor of Yahweh, which you find in Leviticus 3. And yet the lackeys here, the priests, they were taking what they wanted. Even before that, they took the raw uncooked meat to just do whatever they wanted to do with it. And as you mentioned, if people, knowing the law, knowing the provisions, try to stop them, they threaten force, threaten violence in order to take what they wanted. These were very wicked men, and as you said, they do contrast very starkly with Samuel, who served in the Lord's presence, verse 18. And this mere boy, he was only a child. He was still dressed in the linen ephod, and each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife. "May the Lord give you children by this woman in place of the one she has given to the Lord." And then they would go home, and the Lord paid attention to Hannah's needs. And she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. You have this family, Elkanah and Hannah and Samuel, their son, who are very God-fearing people. It seems they have a great piety. They have great respect for the Lord. And reading this it reminds me of your wife, Alan, that she made for your daughter and son, and some Easter clothes this past Sunday. And just like Melanie made those clothes for your children, what we have here is Hannah would make a little robe to put on Samuel. I'm sure for many people who came in to offer sacrifices at the temple and to participate, they would see this little boy and it would just be kind of this cute moment. See this little man already dedicating himself to the service of God. And again, that reminds me of other young men in our congregation who, even though they're young, they have served in various ways, and it's great seeing them get up there. And I think about Elijah, specifically Elijah Benson at church, that you could barely see his head over the podium, but he still gets up there and he pulls down the little mic and he reads scripture on Sunday mornings for us, and he does a great job. And we see this good example of Samuel and his family very much contrasted with Eli and his sons. And really the reality is that Eli and his sons should have been the example themselves, but they weren't. Instead, we have them being very negative examples. 22, Eli was old. He heard about everything his sons were doing to all Israel. And it gets even worse. If we thought it was bad already, it gets worse. They were sleeping with the women who served at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why are you doing these things? I have heard about your evil actions from all the people. No, my sons, the news I hear the Lord's people spreading is not good. If one person sins against another, God can intercede for him. But if a person sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to their father, since the Lord intended to kill them. And by contrast, the boy Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with his people, which is a foreshadowing here. And what we're seeing in this contrast is divinely mentioned here. It is an inspired aspect of this text that the writer wants us to see, that here's the contrast between these people. We have these priests who are really running. I won't mention that. Alan, why does it make total sense that this would be the demeanor of the priest, considering where we've already been in Judges?
I mean, this is the first part where we're like, oh yeah, we're still in that time frame. We're still in that time period. I mean, we finished up the book of Judges with this several different stories about mostly about Levites and what their character was. One of them named Micah, the other is not even named. But we see their moral character and their moral failings, and it makes sense if that's the leadership that's leading the people. It makes sense why the judge's story was so sad, and now you see here the head high priest himself and his two sons just acting wickedly, and Eli. I mean, he's not the one doing that, but I feel like just as guilty just by not even reprimanding him. I mean, he's the head priest, the high priest. Even though he's old, doesn't mean he could. He doesn't have the authority or the ability to demote them or punish them like he should have. I would assume just if he got rid of them, then I don't know if he has any other children, so he would lose, the contrast between, Hannah is wanting children. Well, Eli has children, but he doesn't want to lose his family's place or status. Well, that's exactly what's going to happen over the course of, God's going to punish his family to the point where eventually by Solomon, his family line is no longer part of that high priestly role. It kind of diminishes and dies off. So that's exactly what's going to happen. I think that's what he's trying to avoid by not, getting rid of them or punishing them as they should have. But it's the God appointed one, Samuel, that grows in favor with the Lord and with the people. It's we've kind of given the people a bad rap in the book of Judges, and for good cause, but really the primary blame, I think, falls on the leadership. And because even when the people understood that they were doing wrong, they didn't like these guys, but what could they do? They weren't the leaders. So it comes down to this leadership that fails here, but there's hope with Samuel growing and in favor with the people for once. They like him, and for good reason. He's even as a boy, he was showing how he was much better than his predecessors.
Yeah, this is just a very clear example of a father who knows what's going on is wrong, but just for whatever reason is not willing to do enough to rectify the problem. Now, some of it has to do with the Lord was working in this. He was, his intent was to use these men as an example of what happens whenever you don't respect the Lord, that you don't know his provisions, that you don't appreciate his provisions. Because the priests were well taken care of. They had what they needed. It wasn't as if they were living destitute lives, but they wanted more. They were hungry, not just literally, but also figuratively to assert their rule over the people. And on the other hand, you have this little man, Samuel, who is growing not just in his bodily form, but also spiritually and maturing in that way to the fact that the people respected him, it seems, and the Lord certainly did as well, which is a foreshadowing of Jesus and what is to come. And yet, what is said there in the text that the Lord intended to kill them, that's quickly going to come to pass in what we see here within this text, because a man of God, presumably a prophet of some sort, came to Eli and said to him in verse 27, this is what the Lord says, didn't I reveal myself to your forefathers' family when they were in Egypt and belonged to Pharaoh's palace? Out of all the tribes of Israel, I chose your house to be my priest, to offer sacrifices on my altar, to burn incense, and to wear an ephod in my presence. Also gave your forefathers' family all the Israelite fire offerings. Why then do you despise my sacrifices and offerings that I require at the place of worship? You have honored your sons more than me by making yourselves fat with the best part of all the offerings of my people Israel. Therefore, this is the declaration of the Lord, the God of Israel. I did say that your family and your forefathers' family would walk before me forever, but now this Lord's declaration, no longer. Those who honor me, I will honor, but those who despise me will be disgraced. Look, the days are coming. I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that none in your family will reach old age. You will see distress in the place of worship. In spite of all the good in Israel, and despite of all that is good in Israel, and no one in your family will ever again reach old age. Any man from your family I do not cut off from my altar will bring grief and sadness to you. All your descendants will die violently. This will be the sign that will come to you concerning your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Both of them will die on the same day. And then he says, I will raise up a faithful priest for myself, and he will do whatever is in my heart and mind, and I will establish a lasting dynasty before him, and he will walk before my anointed one for all time. Anyone who is left in your family will come and bow to him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread. He will say, please appoint me to some priestly office so I can have a piece of bread to eat. The ramifications of Eli's unwillingness to really put his foot down and correct the immorality and the defilement of the Lord's offerings is going to lead to disastrous consequences, which, again, that's Judges all over again. The sins of the people led to consequences, and the Lord is going to accomplish his will. If you don't want to participate in God's plan, if you don't want to positively support it, then the Lord's going to get you out of the way, and he's going to get somebody in that place that's going to do what he desires to be done. And that's exactly what we see here as we close out this text, Alan, the punishment that awaits Eli and his family because of the continued sins of his sons.
And we'll see that this has far reaching throughout the book of Samuel. We're going to come back to this prophecy pretty quickly here in the next couple, I guess probably by the next, chapter 4, we see Hophni and Phinehas meet their end very quickly, the two wicked sons. But then it talks about the whole family, and later on in the book of Samuel, we're going to see Saul. If you remember, he goes and he's hunting David, and David received kindness from the priests while he was there. So Saul has a foreigner kill all the priests. Well, most of those priests would have been the same family, descendants of Eli, or at least part of that same family. We see through other genealogies in the Bible that Eli was a descendant of the fourth son of Aaron. If you remember, Aaron's first two sons, Nadab and Abihu, were killed by God, much like Eli's sons.
Leviticus
and
10
then
is.
the high priesthood kind of passed to his third son, Eleazar, and then Aaron had a fourth son, Ithamar. So they kind of took over as the leadership. And we don't really see much after that. Eleazar had a son named Phineas. We know a lot about from the book of Judges and the book of Joshua. He was a good man, but uh, we don't know much about after Phineas through the time of Judges. Somewhere in there, Eli's side of the family, the Ithamar side, kind of must have taken over as the high priestly line instead of that of Eleazar and Phineas in their line. But if you remember, Phineas was, because of his righteousness and zeal, he was promised that his family would kind of rule, not rule, but they would be high priests forever. And we'll see that finally get corrected with Zadok and Abiathar in the time of David and mostly in the time of Solomon. But all of these things mentioned about Eli's family will come to pass here, and we'll see that here in the book of Samuel. So another setting up. These first couple of chapters are setting up a lot of things that are going to happen throughout the rest of the book. And then, of course, the end of this chapter, verse 35 and 36, I will raise up a faithful priest for myself. He will do whatever is in my heart and mind. I will establish a lasting dynasty for him, and he will walk before my anointed one for all time. Very difficult verses here, because of the multiple meanings. We talked about a lot of prophecies that sometimes have not just one, but maybe a second meaning behind it, usually a more immediate one, maybe talking about David, and then a longer term one talking about Christ. And I think we're kind of seeing that a little bit here. I mean, who is this faithful priest that he's raising up? Establishing a dynasty for a priest. Well, I mean, yes, that could be talking about going back to Zadok, who will be the priest during the days of Solomon, and he is a descendant of Eleazar, the third son of Aaron. So getting back to that line, that could be it. But I think another secondary one is even talking about David himself. I mean, he in many ways he takes on the priestly role, maybe not necessarily offering the sacrifices. I think that he understood that was the job of the Levites, but acting in the way that priests were supposed to. I mean, he really established temple worship and restored all of that had kind of fallen by the wayside over in the days of the judges. So he acts in a priest in that way. Of course, his dynasty will be last forever. And of course, and he will walk before my anointed one for all time. Well, that doesn't sound like a normal person right there, someone that walks before my anointed for all time. So that's talking about, I think, big picture, and talking about, if we're talking about David and his dynasty walking before the coming Christ, I think is maybe a longer term result of this prophecy as well. So difficult verse to really tie down, and I think that's the point. It's got multiple meanings behind it.
Yeah, referring to the end of Eli's reign as the high priest, and just being in that position. 2 Kings chapter 2 and verse 27, or 1 Kings chapter 2 and verse 27 specifically mentions the fulfillment of what the Lord had spoken in this text, that Samuel banished Abiathar from being the Lord's priest, and it fulfilled the Lord's prophecy he had spoken at Shiloh against Eli's family. Again, that going back to here in 1 Samuel chapter 2, the end of this text, and the punishment for what had been done because of not just the failures of his sons, but his failure to rein them in and to get them where they ought to be. That 36 or 35 and 36 is just, it is tough, because there's ambiguity enough to just not be for certain about who is what here, at least in the immediate sense. But I do think those are obviously pointing towards this language of the anointed, of something being for all time, being everlasting. That's all very messianic language that is ultimately going to be fulfilled in Jesus. So here we have here at least maybe three different allusions to Jesus within this text. First one being in verse 10, with God giving power to his king and lifting up the horn of his anointed. Then in verse 26, by contrast, the boy Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with his people, which is said about Jesus in the Gospels. And then finally, that language in verse 35 about faithful priest, everlasting dynasty, his anointed one, all that too, very, very messianic language found here, which is just, I hope is impressing upon us the reality of what is happening here. The fact that this is one big unified story, which is leading to Jesus, which is all pointing us in that direction. We have men here who are fulfilling important roles, yet they all have flaws and failures, even the greatest of them, like Samuel and David, which is why they look for someone greater. And that one greater is going to be Jesus, who will finally come once we get past this portion of Israel's history and into what is found within the Gospels and the New Testament. Alan, what do you have to finish us up with today, where we close out with this study of 1 Samuel chapter 2?
Yeah, unfortunately, by I guess next week we'll take a break from Eli for a second, Eli's family, and talk more about Samuel. Well, actually, we won't, because Samuel's first kind of prophetic call here will be against Eli. So if Eli didn't get the message here, it's kind of it'll be kind of interesting. You know, it mentions in chapter 3 and verse 1 how there's not really very many prophetic visions. And it kind of makes sense given the state of those that would be getting those, the priests. They should be the ones speaking and communing with God. And notice it was a man of God, verse 27, that came to Eli. You know, God didn't go straight to Eli; he had to send someone else. I mean, I think that shows the state of moral character Eli and his family were in, that God had to go somewhere else to deliver this message, and to deliver it multiple times. Because you would think if Eli, if I heard this coming from a man of God and I believed it, I would try to do something about it. I mean, even if it's, you know, set in stone, you know, well, at least I'm going to try to prevent all this from happening to my family, and do something. But seems like nothing's happened. We'll see it again in chapter 3. Samuel's going to warn him about it, and still nothing happens. So so this prophecy is going to be fulfilled because, you know, Eli never did anything.
Right. Yeah. It was probably to Eli's benefit in this moment that the Lord himself did not appear to him. I don't think that would have ended very well for him or for his family in this very moment. But thank you, Alan. Thank you for a good insight today. Again, I think you said it well, that so much of what we see here in chapters 1 and 2 is really setting us up for the rest of the text. It is not a true prologue, as we found within the Judges story, but it is very much laying a foundation for what we're going to see within Israel's history moving forward, with Samuel serving the role he's going to serve, and also of the people and their struggles, and then Saul being put onto the scene, being cut down, and then David rising up. There's so much here, so much of that story, the foundation's laid here. And I'm sure as we go through, we're going to continue to refer back to this text to say, hey, remember we saw this here. Well, here comes that echo, or here comes that theme returning to the forefront of the story. We'll note that as we go throughout this text. Thank you so much for being with us today. Hope this has been a beneficial study for you, that your knowledge of the story here in Samuel has grown, at least to some extent. And we hope that in doing so, that the faithfulness of Samuel, the faithfulness of Hannah and Elkanah, that it stands out to you and it encourages you in your faithfulness. We talked from chapter 1 about the difficult moments ought to lead us to reach out for God even more. And the same I think is true here. Whenever we see evil men, that ought not cause us to be discouraged from seeking God, but ought to cause us to seek him all the more, and to not let others in their sinfulness and in their unfaithfulness to drag us down. Even though Samuel was in a very bad environment, honestly, he did not have good people to look up to in this moment. He still continued to grow, and we can do the same as long as we're looking to the Lord, trusting in him, and recognizing that men can be great and men can be bad, Let's focus on the Lord, who is always good. He certainly is good all the time. Alan, thanks for being with us again. Hope you all have a great rest of your Friday. If you're looking for a church family to worship with this upcoming Sunday in a couple of days, hope you'll join us at the Pleasant Plains Church of Christ, 384 Pleasant Plains Road in Jackson, Tennessee. I'll be preaching from the text of Mark 11 with the triumphal entry. Jesus has been on a long journey back to Jerusalem. Now it's time to enter in, and the people recognize something really special is about to happen. We're going to talk about that text Sunday morning. We'd love for you to join us. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know, and we'll see you next time as we continue our walk through history, the story of God's word within the Bible, this story leading us to Jesus. Hope you benefited from it today. Hope you have a great weekend. God bless you in all that you do.